All right, we have enough people in here. Hello and welcome to PMP Live. I'm Alan Watke, an event coordinator with Politics and Prose. Thank you all for joining us in this virtual format tonight with Olga Grushin and her new novel, The Charmed Wife. At any point during the event, you can click on the link in the chat to purchase The Charmed Wife on Politics and Prose's website. You'll be able to ask Olga a question by clicking on the Q&A link, which can be found near the bottom of your screen. We will get to the audience question portion towards the end of the reading, and we'll try to get to all of your questions, but we apologize if we do run out of time. Finally, we want to thank you all for being here with us today. We're so thankful to our family of loyal customers keeping our business and our spirits afloat. And now I'd like to welcome to PMP Live, Olga Grushin. Grushin, celebrating her new novel, The Charmed Wife, which just came out today. We're so excited. And it's endlessly surprising, wildly inventive, and decidedly modern. The Charmed Wife weaves together time and place, fantasy and reality to conjure a world unlike any other. Nothing in it is quite what it seems. The twists and turns of its magical, dark, and swiftly shifting paths take us deep into the magical, dark, and into the heart of what makes us unique, of romance and marriage, and of the very nature of storytelling. Olga was born in Moscow and moved to the US at 18. She is the author of 3 previous novels, 40 Rooms, The Line, and The Dream Life of Sukhanov. Her debut, which was her debut and won the New York Public Library Young Lions Fiction Award, earned her a place on Granta's Once a Decade Best Young American Novelist list, and was one of the New York Times notable books of the year. Both it and The Line were among the Washington Post 10 best books of the year, and 40 Rooms was named a Kirkus Review's best fiction of the year. Grushin writes in English, and her work has been translated into 16 languages. Olga will be joined in conversation tonight with Daniel Wallace, author of 6 novels, including Big Fish. He has published stories in numerous magazines, including Story, Glimmer Train, Prairie Schooner, and Shenandoah. And his short stories have appeared in over 50 magazines and periodicals. And so now, without further ado, please welcome to PMP Live, Olga Grushin and Daniel Wallace. Thank you and welcome.
Thanks, Alan. Really appreciate it. Really happy to be here. And it's so good to see you, Olga, for the first time. And I don't even know.
Yeah, let's not count. Many years.
Many years. I have a lot to say, a lot to talk about. And but I thought it would be good to have you give a little bit of a preface to the book, talk about the book as you understand it, and then read a little bit of it.
It's always so hard for writers to talk about how they understand their own books. It's
Sure.
a tricky question. But so The Charmed Wife is an unusual book. It's a departure for me. It's my 4th novel, and the 3 previous novels were, I suppose, more firmly in what is called the literary fiction camp, even though I'm very uneasy about the literary fiction term. I mean, where do you draw the boundary, really? But this one is a mix of fantasy and realism. It starts as a fairy tale retelling, specifically of Cinderella's story, and then it veers off in an entirely different direction. More fairy tales come in, and then it's mixed with reality. And I don't want to give too much away, but the book really is. It morphs into something else. It ends in a place very different from where it starts. But it does take on the idea of happily ever after stories, the fairy tales. And the idea for the book came from my readings as a child and my love of fairy tales. And then my young daughter's complete rejection of the fairy tales when I tried reading them to her in turn. She hated them. And it got me thinking about the stories that we read and the stories that we tell our children, and how we see these constant coupling, happy ending narratives. And that was sort of the start of it. And then I started reading fairy tale theory and got deeper into it. But when I was thinking about a short excerpt to read from the book, I had a bit of a dilemma because I wanted to find something that gives people an idea of a book, and it's tricky to do. Because, like I said, the book is not uniform. It ends up in a very different place. But I did pick a short excerpt. It's just a page. I won't read long, and then we can talk about it. This is at a later point in the book, in the section where Cinderella is working as a cleaning maid for several households. And these are housewives in a place much like Connecticut at a time much like 1950s. So, and she's working for several clients. So this is the short segment. They long to talk to me. They act all frosty at first, but the instructional articles they favor in the Good Housekeeping magazine have advised them to keep their distance from their help. Yet after a while, weeks in some cases, mere days in others, they feel reassured by the fact that I have not made any requests for monetary advances, nor have their precious candlesticks or silver spoons gone missing. So they begin to linger in doorways of dining rooms while I dust their displayed wedding china. And they chat about this and that, and then at the end of the day, invite me to partake in cups of tea, relaxing pills, and confessions. I take no pills, share no confessions of my own in return, and offer little encouragement. But little is all that is needed, it seems, and I hear their stories. And perhaps the stories I hear are not precisely the stories they tell, but by now I know enough about love and princess to discern, beneath the cheery inflections of their genteel fantasies, beneath the cherry veneer of their civilized mid-century dwellings, the dark, heady danger of primitive transformations, the rank odors of beasts prowling through the woods. There are 5 of them, one for each day of my working week. The Monday princess, the oldest and most resigned of the lot, met her husband when she was out for a stroll in the park, gathering flowers for her parents' mantelpiece arrangement, and he a stag pursued by a vicious hunt. He bounded over for help, pleaded with her to give him her heart, for only thus would the enchantment be broken. Only thus would he resume his true, his human form. She felt sorry for him because of the frantic rolling of his golden eyes, the foaming of his blackened lips, and chose to believe him. And once her heart was firmly in his possession, he did make one fine-looking, graceful man. But these days, almost 2 decades later, she often finds her ceiling scuffed by antlers and her rugs imprinted by hooves. So she has begun to suspect that he lied to her, is lying to her still, that his true form has always been that of a stag, and he gladly reverts to his prancing, doe-chasing ways whenever her back is turned, then pretends to misunderstand her tired questions in the mornings. And 3 or 4 times now, she has stumbled upon her heart, once his greatest treasure, he said, lying forgotten on windowsills or in kitchen drawers. So.
Olga, I think that's a great excerpt to pick because it's a great example of what this book is like and the way that it mixes the real and the unreal, the magical, and just the quotidian life that we live. And it does so seamlessly, just in a remarkable way. I remember when we first met in the beginning, close to the beginning of this century, and and you said something that stuck with me. You said, I have 12 books in my mind that I want to write. I think that is what you said, and you had a list of them, and you were going to write them one after the other. And I'm just wondering, was this book on the list?
It was not. And the list has grown, by the way. Now I have 50 books on the list, and it's a problem for me because at the rate at which I'm writing books, it's going to take me a few centuries or a millennium to get through them. But this one was not, and this keeps happening, by the way. I still have the list. I still intend to get to the books that I wanted to write when I was, in my 30s or even going back to my 20s. But new ideas keep occurring to me and things keep being pushed back. So With this particular book, I was actually working on something else. And it was a kind of a also somewhat magical book, but set in Prague. And then this idea just occurred to me, and it really seized me. It seemed very urgent because it was kind of a dark period in my own life at the time. And this book is obviously not at all autobiographical. There are no talking mice in my life, and I never try to curse anyone at Crossroads, but it does deal with issues of marriage and divorce and happy endings. And this was something that I was thinking at that time in my life. So this did come out of nowhere. And by the way, it's happening again because I thought, okay, now I can get back to my Prague novel. And now another idea came to me, which is dark and dystopian and very much of the times. So I'm doing that next. But anyway, so yes, so this was not on the list, and it keeps happening. And I'm sure it happens to you too. Some ideas take years to kind of crop up to the surface, and others just come all at once, and then you have to do them.
Yeah, and I don't think you can pick the ones that you're going to write, or the ones you're going to write when you're going to write them necessarily. Where are those 12 books that you had in 2003 or 5 or whenever it was? Where are they on the list now? Are they just pushed back and others come in behind it?
Yeah, I think it's not, you know what, when I was younger, it was a very organized list. Now it's just bits and pieces and notes and ideas and notebooks, and they're still all somewhere, but there's no organized queue. So it's not like now I'm getting to novel number 18. No,
Yeah,
it's
right.
not like that. So it's there's some themes that are important to me, themes of memory and time and history, myths. So these themes, they're on the list, they will keep recurring, and I explore them more or less in, all of my books.
Mhm.
But the precise ideas, yeah, they morph.
Sure. Sure. I feel like there are elements of magic in all of your books,
Oh yes, absolutely.
you know.
Absolutely. As in yours. It's
Mhm.
for the most part, not the last one so
Yeah,
far.
not so much the last one. Um, but um, but so how do you people, reviewers and you on occasion have referred to this book as a kind of a fairy tale. And to me, well, I would be interested in what you think of as a fairy tale, or how you define that.
Yeah, so I don't know. It's a very easy way to describe something. It's kind of a package and it fits into a certain genre. But this book really falls between genres, which is a bit of a risk to take as a writer. But then if we didn't take risks as writers, why write at all? It's boring to tell the same
Mhm.
straightforward traditional story of, for me and for you, I'm sure it's. Um, so I think of it more as a very modern story that explores our modern life through fairy tale metaphors.
Mhm.
Of course, you can't really say that on the book jacket because it sounds very clunky and everyone will go, "What?"
Yeah.
But to me, once you start thinking about fairy tales, and that was the fascinating thing for me to explore in this book, so many of the fairy tale images, very traditional images, you think, poisoned apple, magic mirror, bloody key, what have you. So many of them actually can serve as kind of metaphors or parallels to things in modern life. You can take the magic mirror, for example, and it's electronic surveillance, or you can take magic potions and they can stand for drugs. And it's these kinds of parallels that were interesting for me to explore in the book. So is it a fairy tale? It starts off as one. And I think that's what's um, to my mind is different about this book, is that if readers come into this expecting a straightforward fairy tale, they will be very unsettled,
Mhm.
because it does go into a very unsettling place, and it's very much the point of it. Um,
So I think people's idea of what fairy tales are is wrong. Just in general. I mean, I got this Grimm's Brother Grimm fairy tale book down. I was just looking at the bookshelf today and came upon it. I wasn't really even looking for it, and they are very dark. You
oh
know,
yes.
and I just thumbed to this page that this was marked for. I don't know why, but It's the juniper tree, and
Oh,
there's a
that's the darkest. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
yeah, there's this. I'm sure you know it.
Story. Oh, yeah.
But the bird began sings. My mother killed her little son. My father grieved when I was gone. My sister loved me best of all. She laid her kerchief over me and took my bones that they might lie underneath the juniper tree. And this is not what people think of in the modern idea of what fairy tales are and what they've been turned into by Disney.
They've been really sanitized. And that happened actually at the time of the Brothers Grimm's too. You must have the original edition because
It's
they,
a first edition. It's one that's written in the original German. Yeah.
they got really cleaned up.
Yeah.
The original stories, if you look at them, and I read a lot of fairy tale theory, and some of it is so much of it is fascinating. There's one theory that the darkest stories were told by peasant women, and they had all these real, issues that troubled real people at the time, hunger and
Mhm.
death among children and all these things. And then once the stories kind of moved on and were told by upperclassmen, then they became these sanitized versions of knights rescuing maidens. But
Mhm.
that's not what they were originally. And the original Cinderella, the one in the original Brothers Grimm, it's a story of revenge. It's, if you remember the story, Cinderella never is said to love the prince. The prince doesn't seem to care about her as much as he doesn't recognize her when he's given two false brides first one, first the other. And there is no, they were masked or they were veiled. No, he just takes first one woman, then the other woman. And then he only realizes that they were not his bride when he sees that their feet are bleeding because they've cut off their, bits of their feet. It's horrible, really. And then, of course, it ends with the blinding of the two sisters.
Mhm.
That's Cinderella's revenge. So these are very dark stories, and I won't even go into Sleeping Beauty. That one, if anyone is curious, they should look it up. It's dark and grim. And the prince doesn't come off very well at all in it.
And this book also is writes about the real world in a shadowed way, but not a dark way. Certainly not as dark as that.
No, there's no children being eaten there. No,
Not too, yeah. I looked for them. There were none. Yeah.
no, none, no.
So when your process with this book, you had the idea or something like the idea. Did you start writing it and then start reading research, fairy tale, folk tale, myth, start researching that, or did you write first?
So with a lot of books, the idea comes and then I write usually a page or two that are completely unplanned. And I'm sure that happens to a lot of writers. I don't know if it happens to you probably,
Mhm.
but I've heard people say that you are overtaken by some notion and you write down a page or two and later you forget all about it. But in my case, I did write a couple of pages that was a scene that actually ended up not being in the book at all. It
Mhm.
was Cinderella talking to a singing bird and telling the bird about her life. And so that was just the start, complaining to the bird, I must say. And then after that, I usually spend a few months to a year researching, not so much researching, but reading around the subject. So I will take notes. I will let things just kind of grow in my mind. And I will, in this case, I read a lot of fairy tales and I read a lot of Cinderella versions, going back to the Chinese one. And then I read, of course, a lot of theory and I read moderate amount of retellings. I didn't want to read anything modern too much, but I'd read before that. I'd read Angela Carter and
Mhm.
Donahue and the classic retellings like that. So, and after that, I usually look through my notes and I come up with an outline. So when I start actually writing, I have an outline in mind, but the outline is very free.
Mhm.
So it allows for a lot of leeway. So, for example, I knew what fairy tales would come into the story, but I did not necessarily have a clear idea of how they would all interconnect. And I find that a lot of it comes as I write, and it's something that I love, maybe even most about writing, the way all these things just kind of click and you feel, oh, maybe that's what I had in some deep writerly subconscious back of my mind. I knew this all along. This was going to work out this way. But I love these Easter eggs and connections. And I always, it's a very Nabokovian kind of approach. In his books, there are layers upon layers of hidden connections and hidden meanings and little clues that he, kind of scatters everywhere, and you don't have to notice them. But if you do, you feel such a glow of satisfaction. And I love doing that too. So in all of my books, there's a lot of that. And I don't beat readers over the head with it. So if you don't notice how something is interconnected or how things are related, that's, it's fine. But if you do, I think, it gives me pleasure to write it. So I think it must be fun to discover it maybe as a reader.
I've always thought of you as being sort of a granddaughter of Nabokov, and your style is, I feel, is related to his on so many levels, and in this one that you just touched on. As I started this book, I thought, well, maybe she's working in a different vein now. But then as the book progressed, it became so layered and so Nabokovian, and just with these Easter eggs and with the deepening of the story is what's really so remarkable about this, is that like magic, like entering a magical world, the book takes you deeper and deeper into this world that really has never existed before, and you're lost in it and then you're brought back up to the surface.
I think I've just decided you're my ideal reader.
Well, I think you're I envy you so much, and I think that's the best. That means it's a good book. I think your writing, all of your books are so impressive and so smart and yet so open and friendly to a reader. So that's one of the many things that I admire about your book. When you're writing in this vein, though, in this magical vein, let's just make it sort of a blanket term, there have to be rules, some sorts of rules that you are there rules that you impose on yourself as you're working on a book like this? Like, you can go so far, but not this far.
Yeah, well, actually, short of eating children, this book was pretty rule-free. I felt, it was very liberating to write this book because it was not at all like my usual books. I started off being a much more structured writer than I am right now, I think. And again, I still have the outline, that's important. But with Sohanov, with my first novel, The Dream Life of Sohanov, I had such a mathematical approach to things. And I can sort of feel it in that first book that, it's a story of an artist who gives up his art and becomes a bureaucrat. And 23 years later, he has this moment of comeuppance in the last days of the Soviet Union. So 23 years later, there were 23 chapters in the book. And I knew going into it that there will be 23 chapters in the book because it stood for, and there are things like that, of course, 40 rooms, it had to have 40 chapters. So with this book, it was a lot more free-flowing. And actually, my original structure was a lot more rigid. There was a scheme to it that I abandoned. But originally, the premise of the book, Cinderella is very unhappy at the start. And she doesn't like being in her marriage anymore. So she goes to meet with a witch at the crossroads in the middle of the night. And she asks the witch for a spell. And the witch deals in love potions, but Cinderella asks for a spell to kill her husband. And to perform the spell, the witch needs as many hairs from the head of her husband as the years they've been married, which in her case is 13 and a half. So the book opens with her cutting off surreptitiously a lock of her husband's hair when he sleeps and bringing it to the witch. And so traditionally, originally I had this very rigid structure of, instead of doing chapters, I had hair 1, hair 2, and as she drops each hair into the cauldron, she goes back to that year of her life and thinks about it. And that is still preserved to a certain extent, and that the first part of the book does look over her years. But I've abandoned that. It seemed too rigid for this book because I loved the whimsy of it, really, and how fun it was to write for me, because I'd never done anything like this. And so I decided to just kind of have a more free-flowing approach. And I had these moments of thinking and really being shocked at myself, thinking, can I really do that? Can I really write this scene? Can I really say that? Because I don't usually do that. And then why not? So yes, with this book, the rules kind of went out the window.
That's great. That's great. You're freeing up. But you do talk so much about research, which to me is, I hate research, and I would rather just make something up.
It's
and
not
pretend that
research.
true.
Yeah,
It's not research.
it's not research. Yeah, but do you do research?
No, I don't. I do very little. That's why I try not to write anything that's too far outside of my own experience. But I am writing a book now that takes place part of the time in the 1920s. So I am reading a little bit about the 1920s, but I'm not going overboard. I'll read a few books, or maybe less than a few, but I'm interested in the balance between this almost mathematical organizational way you come at writing and your own experience, and like what in your life inspires you to write the book that you're writing when you write it. You mentioned that this book was inspired in some way by things that you were going through in your own life. And do you find that is what happened with your other books as well at all?
No, so my books are not autobiographical because so I have to be really interested in whatever I write. And I know my life, and it's not interesting for me to spend several years going through it. I live it every day. Why do that? So I sometimes think, to go back to the question of how I pick my subjects of the books, it's whatever I'm most interested in at the moment, whatever I'm drawn to at the moment. And fairy tales is a fascinating subject, or art, underground painting in the Soviet Union for my first book, ballet and music of Stravinsky for my second book. So there are these big blocks, and that's really what I mean by research. They're not historical. They're certainly not factual. I just read around the subject a lot to just kind of immerse myself in the period or in the subject, and then I come up with something that has no grounding in reality. But for this book, so the prompting was there, but of course, there's nothing autobiographical in it. And the marriage of Cinderella goes wrong in ways that are very different and a lot more dramatic, I should say. My life, I think most writers have very boring lives. It wouldn't make any kind of a book.
Wow.
The only autobiographical element that is surprisingly in the book is not what you would think about, but there is this parallel subplot in the book of Cinderella's mice.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, you think of the classic Disney movie, Gus and whatever. Gus. Someone knows, I'm sure. I don't remember. But that's not where they came from. In fact, initially, I wasn't even going to have, there's some mention of mice, but that was it. But then as I was writing the story, it's really this romance-heavy story about, people obsessing over their relationships. And it seemed kind of very superficial in some ways. So I wanted to introduce the downstairs, upstairs dimension to it. It's almost like you have, creatures, in this case, mice with real problems, because in my book, there's this parallel multi-generational saga of the mice that unfolds, and
Right.
their wars and their revolutions and their cultural upheavals, while up above, it's still all waltzing and agonizing, does he love me, does he not? So that was very much intentional. So the mice actually came from something autobiographical. I know it's not. We had so the idea in the book is that Cinderella has the original two mice, Brie and Nibbles, but of course they don't live long enough, as mice wouldn't, and so eventually they die of happy old age. But before they die, not wanting to distress her, they pass their mantle, so to speak, to their offspring, and they become Brie and Nibbles, so that Cinderella doesn't notice anything amiss. And it's in the course of the book, they go through many generations of these mice, and they're, Brie and Nibbles, 7th, 8th, whatever. So we had that happen. I found 2 baby mice in our basement, and I tried to nurse them. They were blind and they were tiny, and I didn't know what to do with them. And I looked on the internet, and it said to feed them with melted peanut butter from a dropper. So I stayed up all night doing that, and one of them died. And this is when my kids were younger, and I was very sad and thinking, because they really taken to the mice. And I thought, how am I going to tell them about this? But then, as luck would have it, I went back to the basement and found a 3rd little baby mouse. And I'm like, I'm going to do the goldfish trick. It's the same goldfish. So I replaced one of them. That was my Nibbles the second. And that's what gave birth to this idea, really. So that's the autobiographical element. My kids, by the way, were not oblivious like Cinderella. They noticed. They weren't buying it.
They weren't buying it all.
No.
They will not read this book, or?
Oh, no.
No.
So my son, I would let him, but I think probably reading your parents' books is not what any child wants to do. I don't know what your experience is like, but in my experience, it's funny, he's in high school now, and I have gone to high school seminars on my book. There are people reading my book in high school, and I look at these kids and I'm thinking, wow, they're the same age as my son. They're reading my book, but he's not. So no, but my daughter is 12, and this is not a children's book. So one thing that I was thinking about is the tone of the book changes a lot, and that's intentional also. Some of it is kind of very fairy tale, like almost childlike narrative, and then it goes into these deep, dark, very adult places. And that's intentional also. It's sort of, when you think of these kind of pastel colored Disney fairy tales, you think of this kind of childlike, innocent world. And so some parts of it I have read to her, and the very selective few parts. But yes, it'll have to wait a few more years for the whole thing.
I do want to say to the people out there, if you do have a question, put it in the Q&A, and we'll get to them towards the end of this in a few minutes. I don't think it's giving away too much to say that the book starts in a world that anybody familiar with fairy tales knows, and then it does, as you indicated through the passage that you read, it moves into this different world, and yet it does not leave the fairy tales behind. So you carry the tales with you into these different, almost epics. And I'm wondering, that to me seems like that would be such a fun part of writing this book, is taking these traditional tales and reinventing them in ways that correspond to the experience of the reader. And I was wondering what that process was like. And was it just a matter of you sitting there thinking, oh, what can I do with this?
It came very naturally. It was not really kind of a thought out process. I wrote it this way, but of course I wanted to have a jarring element in there. So early on in the book, the jarring is in the kind of opposite direction. There are certain elements that you come across in the fairy tale world, and at first they're far between, but they're supposed to be jarring. And there are these little moments of, wait a second, what's going on? Did the editor do a terrible job here? But then, yes, and then in the real world, or so to speak, there are these fairy tale moments that continue. And it was so much fun to do, because, this kind of transformation from one to the other, and this fluid kind of merging of the two was really, to my mind, the reason I wrote this book. Just kind of looking at fairy tales from the modern perspective, and yet you have on the one hand talking mice, and on the other hand you have maybe therapists and custody arrangements. And yet during the discussion of custody arrangements, you may talk about a royal goat nanny or a royal treasury. And so it was very fun to play with that. And yes, it's not supposed to be it's not supposed to be a very obviously realistic book, but also people who like to have explanations for absolutely everything may also find it rather unsettling, and that's intentional.
Mhm.
You're supposed to interpret things in your own way, and you can see it um, as one way, as a kind of maybe an allegory or I don't want to give too much away, but there are different ways of coming at the book, and I can't say that one is right and one is wrong because that's all in there. It was supposed to be. At one point I compare it to an Escher drawing, one of these drawings, and that's why I love the cover. The cover has this the Escher like staircases on it.
Yeah.
And those Escher drawings that have birds on one hand and horses on the other, or like that famous rabbit duck that you can look at it and it's a rabbit, and you can look at it and it's a duck. You know the one I mean, that
Yeah.
little. So that's what I was going for, and I let myself do it in a very fluid way because I thought that if I did it kind of artificially, if I approached every scene as what can I do here to, I don't know, confuse people, then it wouldn't work. But if I wrote it that way, then it somehow made sense to me. If that makes sense to you, I don't know.
No, it does, and it's not unsettling to me in the least. I loved, I have to say, Sleeping Beauty is an amazing. Not even, I mean, it's, you go through so many of these different fairy tales and you insert them and move them around and play with them in so many ways. But Sleeping Beauty was one of my favorites.
Thank you.
How much influence do you think these traditional fairy tales have on our lives?
Yeah, I think quite a lot. Something I read recently stuck with me. It was Neil Gaiman was talking about fairy tales, and of course Neil Gaiman retells them and plays with them. And he said that, I forget the exact quote, but he said that the fascinating or the most important part of the fairy tales is the retelling.
Mhm.
And that really stuck to me because we're given these very, very basic stories that are stripped of much psychology. If you look at the original tales, they don't mention much emotion. It's basically, kind of little stick figures moving around in different compositions. And then we fill it with meaning based on the time we live in, or who is telling the story, who the story is intended for. So there are these archetypes that kind of change, but I think they stick with us. And it's, this book, so, some people I've seen, they've taken it as somewhat cynical, or you know, yeah, it's a feminist, cynical take on, and I thought of it as a very life affirming, optimistic book, but
Mhm.
it takes these stories that we grow up with that are very restrictive in some ways. If you look at them in a Disney kind of sense of a story, a beautiful maiden does nothing much, and then the prince on a white horse swoops down and rescues her. They're very restrictive. And so what I try to do is kind of take these fairy tale ideas and, I don't know, let them out into the big wide world and let them play out there. And um,
Mhm.
and yes, I think they of course continue to have an influence on our lives, but it's also interesting how it changes. The fact that, for example, my daughter, who's a new generation, absolutely hated this whole prince meets princess, and they live happily ever after. I don't know if it's something specific to her,
Mhm.
or if it's basically the new generation, or but I was very much affected by these stories. I maybe didn't quite buy them wholesale, but when I was a child, yes, and a lot of my friends too, we like that. That's growing up in the Soviet Union, which tells you something. There were still all these ideas of happily ever after very much present somewhere in the back of my mind. So I'm sorry for rambling, but I don't.
No, that's exactly what I wanted to hear. I will ask one more question and then we'll look at some of the Q&A questions. But you've been, a book takes a long time to write, and especially good books. And it's a long process. You talked about part of it, and then there's so many other aspects to it. But now, today's the official pub date. It's really,
Yes.
it's done.
Mhm.
You're talking about it now, but in a way, I think you probably already moved on in your mind to the next book. And this book, in a way, doesn't exist for you in the way that it used to. How does it, I guess my question is, how does it feel now to be at this point in the life cycle of a book?
Yeah, it's always like that. And there's always this disconnect, because I think what a lot of readers don't realize, and what I myself did not realize before I'd published a book, was that there's usually a year to a year and a half between the time the book is roughly finished and the time it comes out. Not finished, there'll be many drafts, and but it's, the first draft is finished, and then there's this long process. And by then you have a bit of distance. I actually like that. I like the sense of releasing the book into the world and moving away from it. And, always writers say, the book I'm writing is the best book. You have this urgency, otherwise why bother? So it's the next book that you're writing that your thoughts are really immersed in and you're really excited about. And this book, I don't know. I'm curious. Can I ask you a question? How do you feel when your books come out like that? Is it a relief, or is it a bit of regret, or are you sad to see your babies out there and you can't fix any commas anymore, or what?
I don't know. I guess I'm like you in that I've already, by the time the book has come out, I hope that I've already started to write another book. And this,
think about it, yeah.
And everything that's happened that up to that point is, I'm very much a part of the process. And now that it's out there, you can do some things in order to sort of help it along in its new life, but really it's out of your hands now. So it's just, to me, the process of writing is specifically interesting in this case, that you can devote your life really in a day-to-day way for so long to this one thing, and then it's done and it's over with.
Yeah, it's not like letting children out into the world, is it? You never stop worrying about them.
No.
Out there and it's gone. Of course, you still care and you're still involved in all the, on the post, publication process, and it's fun to talk about it. But it's a very different kind of engagement. It's no longer, it's not the writerly strings, or I don't want to say strings of your heart or something cheesy like that, but it's not your blood anymore. It's sort of out there. Yeah.
People will refer to sections in a book that have finished, have been published, and I won't remember them, or I won't remember a character, because I have just a small capacity in my brain, and I don't have room for two books at the same time, so I have to push it out.
I'm so glad it's not just me. I remember the last one. But that's usually, it's the books before that. And see, for you, you've published 6 now. So it kind of goes deeper back into that haze.
It's a lot to forget.
Yes.
Okay, I want to get to a couple of questions. And this is an interesting one, because I've thought about this myself. How cinematic would you say your book is? Do you think it would make a good movie?
Well, they would have some trouble with the mice, of course, but I think so. And I'm a very visual writer. I have some artistic background. I painted as a child and as a youth, I guess I should say. And of course, I studied art history. So I imagine scenes as I write. And I don't know if it comes through. My first book was actually about an artist. And so it was all colors and what have you. But with this one, too, I kind of position things in my mind. And another thing that helps me is the characters are not based on anyone I know. But visually, it helps me to picture someone I know or someone out there. In this case, actually, and I almost don't want to say it, but for Prince Charming, I pictured a very well-known Hollywood actor, and I had his picture on my desktop while I was writing it, and I don't want to name him because I'm sure he's a lovely person. And I'm sure I'm sure not the prince is not very lovely, but it helped me just seeing those high cheekbones when I was describing the prince or thinking about the prince. So I do that a lot with characters. Sometimes you see some face somewhere, or in a painting, for example,
Mhm.
I did that with 40 rooms. I had a certain painting on my desktop. So yes, I'm a very visual writer, and of course, I would love to see this as, and yeah, I don't want to say anything more not to jinx it, but I'm hoping that there's something.
I don't believe in jinxing, so I will say I do think this would make an amazing movie. It would be an unbelievable movie, and it would probably cost $1 billion, but to make
Or a TV show, I would settle for a long, Netflix
yeah, that would
series.
work too. That would work too. Were there any fairy tales you wanted to include in the book that didn't make the final cut?
Oh, there were so many, but I think I had a very good sense of how many should go in there organically without it feeling too overcrowded in my mind.
Mhm.
And so I started with what absolutely had to go in. So, well, of course, Cinderella, and I think Cinderella became a central story because it's really your archetypal story of happily ever after. And there's rags to riches and this kind of innocent girl who really does nothing except clean houses. And then there was Sleeping Beauty. And 12 Dancing Princesses, which is one of my favorite, and Bluebeard, of course. And then in the section I read, there are a lot of fairy tales that are mentioned in a kind of a fragmentary way. So really no, because I crammed a lot of fairy tales in there. You will find Little Red Riding Hood and Rapunzel and even some nursery rhymes. There's a take on the old woman who lives in a shoe.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's kind of a pastiche of a lot of different stories, and a lot of them are mentioned in a kind of subtle, oblique way that you can blink it and you miss it. But there are a lot of them in there. So.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's amazing in how they flow together and work. It's not, to me, it's not jumpy at all. Um,
Oh.
There you do the little. That's how some of the Easter eggs that you drop in there. I think is the little some of the fairy tales. Really, you don't spend a ton of time on them, and they just flow through, and you don't always know exactly necessarily which one you're talking about. That's one of the wonderful magical parts of this book.
Can I answer one question that I know you're supposed to throw the questions at me, but
You can do whatever you want.
someone is asking me whose portrait it is on your bookshelf, and I know you asked me that before we started, but that's actually my father, and he was a sociologist and philosopher in Russia. He died over 10 years ago, and there are books coming out that use the unpublished. A lot of what he did and back in the Soviet Union was unpublishable. He studied public opinion. And so these are collections of his original essays, a lot of them unpublished. So yes, there's another one. He looks like a Russian philosopher, doesn't he?
Very much so.
Anyway, sorry, back to you now. I couldn't miss that one.
I'm glad that you did that, because I was also interested in, we don't want to, I mean, obviously let's just back to you, but was his writing, his unpublished writing, did he have it, and where was it?
A lot of it was in his desk, in the, we had these big cabinets lining our hallway. There was a lot of it. And so there were stacks and stacks of manuscripts. But in some cases, he had this, for example, one book on mass information in a Soviet city, and they published the first volume, but then they balked at the second one because it was really too out there. And so the second volume had not been published. So there were, manuscripts of different sorts.
Mm-hmm. Which
my mother was in charge of all of that, so
it harkens back to the last question that I asked you, which is how you feel when your book is published. You wonder how a writer such as your father feels when his work is unpublished.
Yeah, I think about it. I think for me personally, the joy is in the writing. And if my publicist is listening, she might not love me saying so, but I don't really think about commercial aspects or even readers, really. I write what is important to me to write, but then it is important to me that it does go out into the world. And, it doesn't have to become this huge runaway bestseller, but I wanted to find the right readers. And, I want, even if it's, however many people, but if someone discovers that is important to me. So I think, some people, they can have the mental ability to just write for the joy of writing and put it in their desk, I think I would find that terribly depressing. So I don't know. I don't know if you're the same way, but
To me, it's like the life cycle of a flea. It just is not complete until that final step.
no, of course,
Getting out
that's
into
the
the world.
point. So people see it or read it.
So I'm interested in this too. What inspired 40 Rooms? It's one of the audience's favorite books.
Oh, well, thank you. So that one actually was prompted by something, a game I played with my son. So there was a time in my life where we moved houses, and the house we moved from was the first house I'd ever lived in, because of course, growing up in Russia, I lived in an apartment, and then coming to America, I always lived in apartments that were sometimes, studio apartments. But then eventually, when I got married and we had our son, we moved to the suburbs and had our first house. And then we moved to another house. And it was this move that was very traumatic for my son, who was, I think, 8 at the time, because that was the only house he'd lived in. And what I did, I played this room game with him. After we moved all the furniture out of the house, I took him through all the rooms, and I said, let's play this game so you remember this house when we move to the next house. Think about the brightest memory in each room and really focus on it, and then you will take that memory with you. And what struck me about this, we did this in all the rooms. I told him mine, he told me his. They were not always the happiest memories, but they were sort of these moments of choice, or kind of moments that really changed something in small ways. So that sort of prompted the thinking about rooms we live in and things that happen in these rooms. And it's a story of a woman's life from the first room to the last room, of childhood to old age. And it was technically very difficult, because think about writing a novel where you never step outside the 4 walls. So there are no surprises, no encounters that aren't planned. It's basically all inside your house. But that's what prompted it, just thinking about each room as a kind of a world. And we do spend so much time in our houses, and and kind of little choices we make that can change our lives. So that was the sort of a source of the idea.
No, it's fascinating, and it's a great book. And it was, I think, setting challenges for yourself as a writer. That's what it sounds like you do in every book, is you set a challenge and say, can I do this?
Yeah, that's what I like. The second book too. So the second book is it's a story of a family waiting in this year-long line for. It's set in this kind of Soviet dystopian world, but it's not historical. It's set in this kind of amorphous time between the 30s and the kind of 70s and 80s. And it's told from the 3 alternating points of view of the 3 family members, father, mother, and son. And then there's the 4th voice behind the scene. It's the grandmother, and you never quite see her talking, but it's this voice that kind of seeps into their dreams, or they think they're hearing it on the radio. So it's sort of this kind of ghostly voice that kind of is present. And the idea was to tell sort of the same events from 3 different points of view, and they don't always realize how they're interconnected, but the reader does. So it's kind of this, coming at it from several angles. So yes, technically also challenging for me to write. And I try to do that. You write in every book, because otherwise it's just not interesting to me to live with something for 2-3 years and not play with some structure or voice or time, or same as with this book, where it's kind of the time does interesting things. We haven't talked about that, but that it's not just the setting that changes, there is the time that does different things. So
yes, it's like flows like a river through this book. Time. You are a great reader. You're one of the best readers, and you read prolifically. How do you do? One of the questions here is, how do you decide what to read next?
Yeah, so as with novels that I want to write next that I never get to write in their order, I have a list of books, great classics and whatnot, that are still gaps and that I should read. And I always get pulled away from them. They're still somewhere in waiting their turn. And because I'm going to live 1,000 years to write all the books I want to write, I will also read all the books I want to read during that time. But I let kind of one thing lead to the next thing. I read in sort of these kind of almost time periods, or styles of reading. You know, for a while I was reading, and I do have a Twitter where I mostly talk about books I read. So for those who do not know, you can follow me on Twitter, and that's what I mostly talk about. So for a while there last year, I got into reading a lot of kind of supernatural books that were totally new to me, and I discovered Algernon Blackwood and Machen and all these people, and Robert Chambers, you know, but so it's just one thing leads to another, and then I'll read something else, and then I will be on to the next thing. So sometimes I will read Russian 19th century, and sometimes I will read, you know, kind of science fiction, or actually, no, I don't read science fiction. Sorry, I try. It's on my list. I try. That's the one thing I somehow not made progress with. But yeah, so it's natural. It leads kind of, I follow my interests, and usually I read kind of 20 to 30 books in that kind of general clump, it seems like. And then I sort of organically move on to the next thing. So there's some, I used to be much more organized. I used to read alphabetically or chronologically. Don't get me started on that. I had all sorts of really mad approaches. I did start once reading everything in chronological order, and I got through everything written in Mesopotamia and ancient Egypt. True story. I read the Book of the Dead. Which almost killed me, by the way. It's really unreadable. And then ancient Greece was wonderful, and ancient Rome was wonderful, and I got stuck in the Middle Ages, and then I thought, okay, this is silly. I'll do something else now. But that took a few years.
Oh,
I'm very well read in ancient Egyptian literature.
I'll come to you with any other questions. So we have time for one more question here, and there are a couple of that relate to each other. So I'll just ask those. Do you plan writing any more of your Russian themed books, like, or what's up with that?
So, you know, like I said, it's interesting for me to explore different things, and I will never say I won't do this or I won't do this, that ever, because things happen organically and stories jump at you. But the first two books were set in the Soviet Union. Well, the first one was set in the historical Soviet Union, the second one in a more amorphous kind of Soviet Union. But after that, I felt like I'd explored the subject enough for now, which is not to say that I will never go there, but the next two books that I have planned, some of them have some Russian connections, you know, there may be a Russian character or something, but they are not set in Russia. And again, that is something that's fascinating for me to explore. One of the things that I'm hoping to do someday when I'm, you know, grown up, is to write about my dad.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something that, you know, I don't know if it would be a novel or if I would even do it as not a memoir. I don't have an interest in writing about myself, but as his biography or something. But he had a fascinating life, and that is something that I'm sort of slowly circling around and thinking I'm not there yet, because it's to me, it's this most important subject I can tackle. So that's one Russian book that's somewhere out there. For the rest, you know, someday probably, maybe, but not in the near future.
Well, I can't tell you how great it's been to spend this time with you, talking about your wonderful book, and how flattered I am to have been asked to do this, and how happy I am to be here on this pub date.
Yeah, I'm so happy you could join me. Thank you. It's so,
I love the book.
Yeah, it's so fun to talk to you. Oh, we should do this more often.
I hope so. I love that. I'm here for you. I will throw it back to Alan now, and with thanks to both of you for putting this together.
Yeah, thank you so much. Oh, and one last thing before you do, I see a lot of questions. So I am on Twitter, and I am maybe not always present there, but I do answer questions or I engage with readers. So if you want to ask me anything that we didn't have time to ask, I'll be happy to do that.
Oh, thank you both so much. That was just fascinating. Absolutely great. I want to thank everyone that joined us today. It's your patronage that enables us to bring you programming like this. And we cannot continue to host these types of events without the book sales to support them. So please do go to the link that's in the chat. That takes you directly to Politics and Prose website. You can purchase Olga's book there, The Charmed Wife. I want to thank Olga and Daniel both for being here, joining us tonight, celebrating your new book just released tonight, today, all day. There it is. Thank you, Daniel. To everyone that joined us, I just want to say again, thank you. Stay well and stay well read.
Thank you.
So much.
Good night.
Thank you.